Okay, welcome to our latest installment of the Political Science Speaker Series. We have a bit of an oversupply of talks this semester, so I'm glad to see that at least a few of you showed up for this talk, and it is my pleasure to introduce to you Hartmut Behr from Newcastle University in the UK, which, as I was just reminded, is also one of Randall's former employers. Hartmut is a native of Germany and studied at the universities of Erlangen, received his PhD in Cologne, and his Habilitation, which is, in a sense, sort of a second PhD that one has to do in Germany to become a professor at the University of Jena. And he has taught at a number of universities in the United States, Germany, and Japan. And we're very pleased to have him with us today. Hartmut has published very widely in a number of different areas in international relations, including immigration policy, terrorism, international political theory, which is related to his talk today. One of his more recent books is History of International Political Theory, as well as an edited collection on the concept of the political, which actually I would very much like to get my hands on at some point.
Let me see what I've got.
And he has really published on an amazing variety of subjects. I only mentioned 2 or 3 of them just now. It's very impressive, and I very much look forward to his talk, which was originally titled Politics of Difference Towards a Phenomenology of Peace. But I believe that the title of the actual talk is a little bit different now. So I'll leave it to Hartmut. Thank you.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much. And thanks very much to you coming to this and joining or spending some 90 minutes with me and my thoughts. And thanks already for your willingness to do so. I'm very appreciated. Thank you very much. So let's just start straight with my argument. The title may be different, but what I want to talk about is basically the same. So even if the title changed, and because it's work in progress, so as you know from your own works, and titles change, right? You think about it this way, then you have a different angle. You think about it this way, then you sleep over it. You have another title. You wake up in the morning with. So it's just very transformative. The whole thing about labeling and finding the right title. What I want to do, however, is basically to briefly talk about and sketch out the main argument of what is work in progress, what is hopefully to be a full book manuscript in about a year's time. So it's really from the workshop, and therefore it's particularly excellent for me to have a chance to talk about it. The argument develops from an attempt to bring 2 bodies of literature together. The one is literature on what we can call thinking difference and otherness in international political theory, also in political philosophy, if you like. And the other body of literature engaged the question of peace building, peace formation. And I hope I found out, or I hope the idea applies somehow, that the way we think and we act upon peace and peace building very much relates to the question how we engage the question of difference and otherness. So I see a strong relation between difference and otherness, or the way we think about it, and peace building, peace formation. And that is basically what I want to interlocute and to bring together. So the framework for the argument I want to unfold for how we should or how we should not think about peace and engage the question of the other and of otherness works basically in 2 directions. The first direction is, if you like, as a critical framework for deconstruction, whatever that blurred thing is, which we call deconstruction, but as a critical framework for thinking or for critiquing a certain Western narrative of peace, as I would call it, or peace building. And in a second step, as a framework to re-articulate or to present a different narrative on peace, which is based on a certain attempt to think the question of difference and otherness. And that is how I want to proceed today, is in a first step to apply or to critique a certain way of thinking about peace as we find it in a certain narrative, and in a second way to unfold an own argument on how we should think difference and otherness, which goes back to basically three authors. First, Alfred Schütz, who is a German sociologist in the mid-20th century, then to Emmanuel Levinas and Jacques Derrida, whom I don't need to mention who they are, I guess. And the way, or their suggestions how to think the question of otherness, which is basically a de-essentializing take on the question. So the first, the critique relates to a certain Western narrative on peace, which is based on, I would argue, essentialist notions of difference and otherness, and believes in the possibility to predetermine, to fix identities, to determine identities in a very much a dichotomist way of self and other, and also to essentialize who the enemy is, who the friend is, who the ally is. And this narrative entails a huge variety of different sources and of different approaches, which share, however, as I would argue, which share the epistemology of essentialist thinking of self and other. And that is what solders these kind of sources together. So on the one hand, this narrative entails a kind of aggressive mode of foreign policy, if you like, but which labels itself as peace. We may like to think ironically or paradoxically or even cynically. And then we may think about names like Caspar Weinberger and Richard Nixon. Also E.H. Carr falls in this kind of category to a certain way. Raymond Aron, in his appreciation of war as a social institution, as I would read it. In the same epistemology, I think we can subsume also very different ways, which we find in the legacies of Woodrow Wilson and Wilsonian thinking about war and peace, which has a certain tradition, which is picked up then in the democracy for peace, or peace democratization as a strategy of peace, a kind of Bruce Russett way to think about it, and its whole metaphysical tenets of history, of historical development. We find this discourse also around the foundation of the League of Nations, and there is a very interesting lecture series called Problems of Peace, which was held between 27 and 38 at the Geneva Institute of International Relations, which engaged the question of peace and of peace building in a way, if you like, which is very interesting to read. And here we find ideas and terminologies like civilization, non-civilization, very essentialist notion of culture and of political agency. So that would be one source which also could be subsumed under this essentialist epistemology of thinking peace and thinking the question of self and other, and in a consequence of thinking peace. Also more contemporarily, the whole discourse, for example, around Libya can be subsumed under this, in this essentializing geopolitical imaginaries. We can take the Blair and Brown discourse around Iraq. We can refer to the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1322. We can refer to the Agenda for Peace. All kind of different sources where we find these essentialized notions. now forgive me for reading a couple of sentences, because I said it's work in progress, just to get the formulation right. What we can tease out, what we can learn from the study of those sources, from a perspective which is informed by the question how to think difference and how to think self and other. So what we learn in all those examples of this peace narrative, which is, I'm very aware of how selective this is, and in terms of methodology, it refers to obviously an institutionalized narrative promoted by governments or government related. But on the other hand, these sources or these agents sets a framework, if you like, again, in which very many NGOs operate and very many peace-building operations take place. So we may also unfold a narrative which is about peace, which is being narrated by NGOs, for example. So that would be a kind of very different. But I would argue the sources I've kind of compiled together here is representative of a very influential and powerful policies which labels itself as peace. So that is, at least I guess, a start for looking into certain narratives. So what we learn from this is a portrayal of world history as in procession of the self. So again, if we study this under self and other relation, we have a certain presupposition and presumptions of the self and who is the self. And the self here, which is the own civilization, the own government, the own culture, if you like, is perceives itself as the, in capital letters, the subject of history, endowed with a very monopolistic reading and writing of politics and insights into its rightful trajectory. So there's only one course of history, one form of agency imagined here, and that is the one of the self. Political alternatives, as a consequence of this, are systematically excluded before the background of ostensibly certified knowledge about right or wrong, and that is what we find in all those sources, if we take it from Woodrow Wilson to Bruce Russett or to Clinton or to Sarkozy, is a certain belief in convictions about right or wrong. So they appear to know what is right and what is wrong. To be honest, I don't know how. Maybe by some kind of metaphysical endowment with certain set pieces of knowledge, which I have no access to. But here we have a very strong idea in convictions, right? In knowledge about right or wrong, in knowledge. So, and even if the other, if we read all this under the question of self and other, has to be put to ashes, the own course of action appears as coinciding with the only rightful things to do, which is a certain way to paraphrase that we bomb out certain communities to create peace, which I think is very cynical. But this creates then kind of mottos, if you like fighting for peace, the enemy is per se uncivilized, then peace needs leadership, peace needs strength, this kind of very ambivalent. And inferiority in order to have peace is unthinkable. So these are kind of snapshots of certain terminologies as they appear in this narrative. So these epistemologies see peace as if necessary, martial manifestation and extension of the self. The self is extension and manifestation are, again in capital letters, the irreducible conditions of peace. So peace is only thinkable and can only be imagined if the self is extending its own spheres of power. And the exclusion, or you may also say forceful inclusion, which I would think is basically the same. If you are excluded or forcefully excluded, it both kind of strips you of your own liberty. The exclusion of the other under dictums of universalized reason is a priori seizure as friend or foe, though these guys always seem to know who is friend and who is foe and why. Right? So identities as ally and enemy seem to be predetermined according to a certain reading of the self-other relation, and of course according to a certain reading of civilization and non-civilization. So all this is, as I put here, an anathematic incongruity with the understanding of peace, which I want to spend the remaining minutes which is an approach to peace coming from a very distinct reading from the question of difference and otherness. Maybe one word to the critique, which I just have forgotten, I guess, is that peace appears here, according to this narrative, if you read it critically from the self-other, first as the basically extension of the self, of the order of the self. So peace, the conditions for peace is a certain kind of imperialism, if you like. Yeah, so an imperialist policy of the self, which means in practical terms some actor imposes its own order upon peace formation processes somewhere else. And second, peace is interchangeably used with stability or security, which I would argue is not what we should normally aspire. So peace should be safeguarded, if you like, as a domain, at least intellectual or philosophical sphere in its own right, and be tried to be filled with some kind of imaginaries. But peace is not to be interchangeably used, I would argue, with stability or security. But that is a consequence of this discourse. If you see peace as an extension of the self, and its order, its political order, economic order, social order, then that is seen or regarded as the provision of security, and then peace is and can be interchangeably used or equated with security. So my apologies for having this kind of introduced after I already indicated I came to my second step of my talk, which now is an attempt basically to communicate to you, or with you would be the better way to put it, the approach to the question of difference, which I would like to introduce, and which should then finally lead to a different or a particular understanding of peace and peace formation processes. As I said, this goes back to Alfred Schütz, Emmanuel Levinas, and Jacques Derrida, and their reading of the self-other relation. And I picked out those three authors because they very explicitly engage the question of otherness. Like in Schütz, we find the figure of the stranger, the migrant, also interestingly the homecomer. Both people or figures who find themselves in an unfamiliar environment, put it this way. The migrant comes to a certain society which may be unknown, and the homecomer, kind of epitomized in the figure of Odysseus, coming back to Ithaca, and no one knows who he is, and even he is not being recognized, not even by his own wife. So the kind of marginalized position towards, as Schütz says, kind of certified, or a group held together by certified knowledges and habits. Then in Levinas, it's the other, as he said, l'autre, the other person. And in Derrida, obviously, difference and the idea of advent in Derrida. Those are three authors, again, and that's why my title, or in my title, has the word phenomenology. I think can be kind of taken together as a phenomenological epistemology and share a same or a common epistemological background, I would argue, which can be found in thinking or in a kind of Heideggerian way to think the ontological question of time and being. And Levinas and Derrida and Schütz have references to the oeuvre of Heidegger, very many actually. So in those phenomenological episteme introduce a way of thinking about time, history, and being, not as entities with fixed meanings. So you don't know who's the enemy, who is the foe, who is my ally. They read history, as I said, not as entities with determined trajectories and terminated identities, and not in a dichotomous or dichotomical way like the self and very opposite the other, but rather, as I would formulate, as open-ended processes of becoming, of development, and of transformation. So instead of fixed identities and predetermined identities, we should talk about transformativities, about development and change. And what is most important, probably, the impossibility to anticipate why someone is and how someone is and what someone is, and also to anticipate certain trajectories of identity development and of history. This epistemology, as a consequence, holds that forms of the cultivation of differences, and I would conclude from certain reading of Schütz, Levinas, and Heidegger and Derrida, of a positive embracement of differences, articulated in perpetual self-reflective and critical discourses, produce and reproduce differences, and thereby create certain meanings of sociality, and in a consequence, or let's say meanings of sociality which are conducive to peace, or more conducive to peaceable politics than essentialist ways to think around the question of self and other. I would argue that this may provide the possibility to think in a non-totalizing way about self and other relations, consisting of an understanding of the principle of temporalized being, so a very Heideggerian notion which we find in all those three orders, of differences as transformative, and accordingly according to this logic would abolish the idea of identity, and as also as untangible, ungraspable, and non-fixable. So all this emphasizes the open-ended nature of this process of the encounter between self and other, or differences, if you like. We are deliberately and distinctively not talking about assimilation, we are not talking about toleration, we are not talking about recognition and acknowledgement. So these are kind of liberalist notions, if you like, which we find in Charles Taylor and Rawls to a certain degree, even if there are very huge differences between their oeuvres and their philosophies, but they share the same kind of imaginaries here, I think, which can be taken together in ideas like assimilation, toleration, recognition, and acknowledgement. But rather, compared to this, or in contrast to this, we speak of an understanding of the principle of their temporalized being, and particularly their transformative articulations. So again, here the non-possibility to predetermine and to fix identities. And it is here, in this critical perception of differences and otherness as primarily transformative becoming, as endless beginnings towards, now a very Derridaian notion, the unknown, and a Levinasian word, impossible to grasp, as discursively produced meanings and openings of alternative spaces for the articulation and embracement of differences, and for the, in a Derridaian sense, the advent of the other. And I think it is exactly here where we find conditions for positive rearticulation of peace, which is so different to the narrative I tried to sketch out in the very beginning, based on essentialist readings. At least I would hope for the possibility to rearticulate peace in a very different way. Now, it is one of my shortfalls when I give a paper that I have no idea about time. I started somewhere and I'm ending up somewhere, but I don't know in terms of time where we are. Would you like to give me a...
You have another 10 or 15 minutes.
Another 10 or 15 minutes. Okay, so maybe we have a chance then to come back to some of the philosophical argument, or nature of the philosophical argument here in our discussion. And let me just jump straight to my conclusions, where I want to suggest some, or discuss, maybe better way to put it, how that philosophical program could translate into a research agenda. So what kind of questions can be asked or could be asked for empirical studies, if you like. Because if that all remains nice philosophy, that is from a politics perspective, I guess not very satisfying. But at least we should suggest, or should be able, or we should think about what kind of questions can be suggested for actual empirical research. Not in order to test the theory, I don't like the idea at all, or to prove or whatsoever, but just to be inspired for a certain engagement with political practice, right? So it's not about right or wrong, whether the theory is right or wrong, but just to conclude, if you like. So, 3 conclusions first, maybe. The first, and I think most important, is the difference, and we can talk about difference between individuals or groups, or I would say very generally where we experience and when we experience something to be different, as a group or as an individual. So that is something to maybe specify, but I understand it here in a very general way. So difference in that general way is not present in an entity in any definable form or in the form of dichotomist relations, but needs to be understood through its own dynamics and articulations. So in a way, difference, we can only say what it is if we study its articulations and not a priori in any kind. And even if not understood or tangible, very often differences stay blurred or bizarre, or we may not understand what exactly is articulated here. They should not be negated on behalf of assimilating rationalities. That is the kind of liberalist notion of recognition, toleration. We don't know what it is, but we tolerate it, see how good we are. So that's not at all the idea here. So it should not be negated on behalf of assimilating rationalities, but I would argue acted towards. And this towards may kind of appear, because I tend to write it in italics, as a kind of linguistic sham fight, which I think it is not. Because I would replace of, so different or relation of or with, I would replace this with towards, because we're acting towards something which is unknown. Right? And of, differences of or relation with, indicates a certain possessive relation. Right? As if we were sovereign about our relation with the other, which I would argue we are not. We are not sovereign about this relation, because it is not necessarily always, but it can be potentially a relation towards the unknown, the ingraspable or ungraspable, as Levinas says, or the intangible. At least that's a very viable possibility. So differences accordingly should not be attempted to extinguish, to assimilate, but they should be kept alive, and I would argue in a very positive embracement and vivacity, and in relationships of critical tension, and those differences should be articulated in the public sphere into the political, if you like. So it's a very different notion than the American motto "E pluribus unum," which presumes this kind of integral. The unum is a kind of integral to assimilate differences into. I came up with an alternative Latin version, which I want not to mention here. So it is, but deliberately not this "E pluribus unum." Third consequence would be a phenomenological epistemology of difference would enable, so is to hope for, peace or peace formation through the abstinence of attempts to deny the conflict parties their own imaginaries and their own ideas about political, social, and economic order. So, in a very practical way, compared to peace building as the imposition of Western ideas about state, bureaucracy, institutions, and to impose those, let's say, on local communities in Afghanistan or local communities in Bosnia or wherever you look into, what would be a result of this or consequence is, instead of peace building, what could be called peace formation, right? Which is very much informed by an emphasis on local communities and their ideas about how to create peace, how to accomplish reconciliation, and so on and so forth. And that in certain dynamics with international agents, NGOs, non-governmental organizations, and so on and so forth. But a very different, in practical terms, kind of very important step away from this Western, or the imposition of Western ideas of state, bureaucracy, institution, rationality, and all kinds on local communities. What I should say as well in practical terms when we talk about conclusions is that I think it's very obvious that what I try to develop here or to suggest is not a policy which can be implemented straight away. So it is nothing which you have got in your briefcase and you go to any national administration and you say, here I've got a recipe for how to accomplish peace, like Bruce Russett could do and say, let's democratize the bastards, and then everything will be fine. It is not that easy. It emphasizes, compared to this, it emphasizes education, kind of very long-term policy effects, like this discourse in local communities, working with local communities for several years. And in a very radical way, maybe, I would like to suggest that typically, maybe, we cannot speak of a peace declaration, and we can never speak of peace being accomplished. But peace would be this endless process of forming certain ways of sociality, certain ways of living together, and it cannot be defined as something, and accordingly it cannot be declared. Right? It would be very cynical, according to this understanding, to declare peace. And then now we have got it, and now we have stick to certain rules and certain regulations, and that will be guaranteeing and will be granting peace to everybody involved. Right? But it would be this endless process of negotiation, of discourse, of articulation of differences, and negotiating meaning from those diverse articulations. So it is not a program which can be straight away implemented by whatever national administration and cannot be suggested as a kind of recipe, if you like. Say, let's do that, and this will follow, and then we have accomplished status A, and that's it. No, it's this kind of never-ending working for peace, if you like, right? Or peaceable sociality. Now, but in terms of research agenda, there are several questions, and they actually more or less, all of them, in different ways, different perspectives, different formulations, but they all would kind of investigate how self-other relations and perception of difference plays out in actual peace formation processes, and how are they discursively framed. Yeah. So you could ask: is an actual peace formation, peace negotiation, and conflict reconciliation processes an awareness of the problem of difference and perception of otherness, and how are they discursively framed? So how do conflict parties see each other? Yeah, do they see each other according to ethnic, national, religious, political, and any kind of essentializing criteria? How do they see each other? Are they stigmatizing themselves a priori to any kind of conflict? So these are our enemies by nature, or referring to some kind of mythology? Or how is the other being seen and how is the other being perceived? This can be explored under the labels of, if you like, border narratives. So we can explore narratives about borders and about identity. What is our identity, in inverted commas, from a researcher's perspective, would need to be put in inverted commas. What is the identity of others? Are those identities being seen as fixed, as natural, or are they being seen as fluent and transformative? Probably not, but at least that could be the kind of norm according to which it can be discussed and studied. Interesting would also be, I guess, to link the perceptions of identity as they can be studied, to link to the failure or success of peace building or peace formation processes. So we may then find out some kind of relation between does a certain perception of identity or of otherness lead to a more or less successful peace formation process. I think that would be fascinating if that kind of relation could be found out. If we perceive otherness and identity in a certain way, that is empirically, there's certain evidence that is conducive to peaceable socialities. Finally, I mean, these questions can be worded in many different ways, but many more ways, but a final set of questions could be formulated around the problem of, let's say, maybe put it this way, in how far and at all can the normativity, which is part of this phenomenological thinking of difference, and perception of otherness, can it be communicated to conflict parties? Right? So is there any kind of learning curve which can be accomplished by communicating to conflict parties or reconciliation parties or parties, communities involved in attempts to reconcile their previous conflicts? Is there any chance, and how would it be maybe in workshops, local workshops, or in schools or whatsoever, to communicate the idea that if you think about your peer and your neighbor in a different way, like non-essentializing, non-dichotomist, put it this way, as a shortcut version, that may help a better kind of neighborhood relation, or that may help the reconciliation process much better than if you perceived the other according to predetermined, stigmatized identities. So how can this work together with local communities? How can it be organized? How can it be conducted, if at all? I mean, it may be very difficult, I could imagine, that as a kind of philosophically informed or convinced armchair scholar, you go to Bosnia-Herzegovina or wherever and you speak to someone and you want to communicate your kind of philosophical ideas. But of course that doesn't speak against the philosophical ideas, but it's a challenge towards a practical attempt to communicate those. Okay, I think I leave it here. I hope I could communicate some ideas, and I'm looking forward to discussing those with you. Thank you very much.